Thank you and welcome. I'd like to focus my remarks today on Southeast False Creek. It's a community that many of you know was the first in Vancouver to have sustainability as a principle, which was to guide its policy statement and its official development plan. I may not use all these slides. I'll just move to a couple when I think they're useful. I'm going to make really just 2 points, and they relate to how we measure sustainability and how we measure those outcomes, and then what the value is in a first project. And so I think when we were asked to identify what worked and what didn't work, when I talk about the measure and the way we measure sustainability, I'm going to suggest that Southeast False Creek on the whole did not work. I will suggest that as a first, it worked quite well. And I think that second point is critical for us when we're thinking about change in the long term. And it's incumbent upon us to remember the time that change takes. And many of you who are in this room have participated in that very change in this city and in this region and can attest to the challenges of making and implementing change over time. So I did my dissertation research on Southeast False Creek, so I had the privilege of interviewing many people who were involved in the project, both conceptually from when it started all the way through to the years of development and implementation. And when I assess Southeast False Creek today, I'm looking at it, and as I did for my dissertation, I was assessing it from an ecologically based perspective of sustainability. It's the same perspective that's been presented by Bill and Jenny and Patrick today. And when I was looking at it, the number in terms of how much the energy and resource emissions we needed to reduce was actually only at 80%, and Patrick's just pointed it as 90. So what I wanted to do with Southeast False Creek is to look at kind of public published metrics and understand what kind of emissions reduction or ecological footprint reduction could accrue to the new residents of this community once it was built out. And it turns out, first of all, it turns out there's not a lot of data available, so that's a really hard number to try to crack. And I'll just put that up, because at the time, and this is about 2 years ago, when I tried to do this assessment, and these are estimated numbers, the required reductions that you see here were about 81 and 73%. And the reductions that I could somehow roughly estimate from Southeast False Creek came to be at about 8 and 4.6%. And those were largely from the planned efficiencies in building performance and also in the neighborhood energy utility. And that's not to take anything away. I would say these numbers, if we're looking for a replicable model, because that's what many perceived Southeast False Creek could be, this is not the model we want to replicate throughout the region if our goal is sustainability on a regional scale. This is not to take away from the efforts and the hard work that people put in over years to achieve the kind of outcomes that we have at Southeast False Creek. But it's to suggest that we need to move far beyond where we are with Southeast False Creek. And so one of the things I think didn't work is that there was no overall metric for what a sustainable community should be, no idea about maybe using an ecological footprint or perhaps greenhouse gas emissions reductions for the whole neighborhood. And there was no set of targets, indicators, there was no reporting system, no monitoring out. And that still doesn't exist there. For specific individual parts of Southeast False Creek, like the neighborhood energy utility, there's some monitoring going on. But there's no public reporting out. There's no sense of evaluating what that community is like as a whole community. So I would say that that's something that did not work in Southeast False Creek, because that is critical. If we don't have a target in mind, how are we setting, how do we know how far we're moving towards that target? Or are we just heading towards perhaps a pointy city that isn't going to get us where we want to go? This is not to say that people didn't think targets were important. Throughout the planning of Southeast False Creek, right from the start, there were consultants to the city, there were new city staff, there were advisors to the city, local advisors, some of you who are here today, who were pushing for sustainability targets and performance metrics. And they were developed, first set by the consultant Shelter, later set in 2005 by a consortium of consultants to the city, but they were never fully adopted. And this takes me back to the point about Southeast Falls Creek as a first and what it means to be the first to try to implement something. And while there are other elements of sustainability we can look back to in other neighborhoods in Vancouver, it's different to try to embed sustainability into your policy documents. And in the interviews I did with people who were involved at the time, they explained that some of the challenges had to do really with getting those targets, getting agreement to including targets from city bureaucracy. Engineers who were going to be held responsible for actually achieving the targets had not been involved in the decision-making around those targets. And so they were not comfortable with the idea of accepting targets. Politicians at the time, so I was told by interviewees, were not very keen to adopt targets that they might not be able to achieve. So much to the disappointment of people who'd participated in the process of developing targets, some of whom are here today, that set of targets was appended to the policy statement. And that was sort of a negotiated out kind of agreement in order to get that policy statement through, or so it was explained to me. And so I think that highlights the challenge of trying to do something for the first time. I've got a quote here from a former city planner who was involved, and who shall remain nameless. We bashed through the war on this thing, meeting after meeting, fight after fight, to lay ground and hold ground, and that was about getting the policy statement through. And I think that's really critical, and I think we just need to recognize as we think about what it is we want to do moving forward, that there are individuals who are working day in, day out, to try and move forward and make some change incrementally. So I would say that one of the things that worked about Southeast Falls Creek is not perhaps its outcomes overall in a metric that I might be able to measure, because we don't want to replicate that. But what it did do is it opened the door, and it created a platform, and it created some capacity locally that didn't exist in the city for sure. The people I interviewed there said both certainly at the senior administrative level, at the bureaucratic level, there was very little awareness of what the concept of sustainability might mean. And so Southeast Falls Creek was an opportunity to open that door. And also for a group of local consultants, professionals, they were able to, as one interviewee told me, play in a sandbox. It was like thinking outside the box, throwing out new ideas that looked beyond. A lot of those ideas didn't get incorporated in the end, but there was that opportunity, and there's actually a nice archive of reports and studies of things that could be done, how far we could go. And some of those are actually being, some of those ideas are actually being implemented as we move forward, or they've arisen again as the city's looking towards some of its greenest city targets. One interviewee, also a former city planner, said to me, and this is what I think the value of firsts is. She said, imagine Vision Vancouver coming in and trying to have the greenest city if we hadn't had Southeast Falls Creek. If we hadn't had that effort of trying to write policy, if we hadn't had that effort of trying to come up with a green building strategy. So I think that speaks to the value, certainly, of firsts. I'd like to end just by saying that one of the things that I also think didn't work in Southeast Falls Creek is that we didn't move towards that paradigm shift that Bill's been talking about, that I think we really need. And that's a shift away from just thinking about energy efficiency to thinking about lifestyle. What is a sustainable lifestyle? I go to Southeast Falls Creek now regularly, just checking up on my study site. For me, there isn't evidence when I visit that place that the people who are inhabiting or using that space are thinking about sustainable living. And I think that that's something we really need to move towards. And it's a question we need to ask ourselves again as we're looking forward in our planning and our thinking about the future. Thank you.